Well, let's talk a little bit about ethical formalism and consequentialism. Incredibly boring, I know. But those are two ways of looking at the same situation and coming up with completely different answers. Consequentialism sounds pretty good because it brings about the results that we intend to bring about, whereas formalism disregards the results and looks to the rightness of the action itself. Right? So if you imagine shooting a gun, right? The question is whether it's right or wrong to shoot the gun. The consequentialist would look at shooting the gun and following the bullet and saying, well, the bullet took out the murderer who was about to assassinate 6 people, right? Therefore, the consequences were justifying the action itself. So you could get the same action shooting that gun and find out that it was right or wrong in a formalist fashion, or that the results that happen as a result of shooting that gun justify or not the action of shooting the gun in the first place. So two different results, same action. Well, that's what the contrast is. So once we get past the idea of virtue ethics, which is what we looked at last couple of videos, we start talking about the contrast between formalism and consequentialism. I'm going to talk about these two together, not because I can give a comprehensive view of formalism and consequentialism in a single 5-minute or 10-minute video, but because I can best introduce those concepts by contrasting them with each other. And those two are essentially polar opposites when it comes to ethical analysis of situations. So there we go, formalism and utilitarianism or consequentialism. I use those words, utilitarianism and consequentialism, essentially interchangeably. And they do not mean exactly the same thing, but they're close enough for the purpose of this video. And so we'll go ahead and continue to refer to those that way. Formalism, also called deontology. Deontology, right? The study of, well, the action itself. I don't think that's a perfect definition of deontology, but that's essentially what ethical formalism turns out to be. We associate ethical formalism with a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant was a Lutheran, right? He was from a very strict Christian upbringing, and he lived his entire life according to those strict rules, not from the Lutheran Church, but from a very specific discipline that he gave to himself, such that he would drink coffee at the same time every morning. He would take a walk through the neighborhood at the same time every day. He would teach his classes for the same number of hours every day, and then he'd come back home and relax and prepare for the day. People would see Immanuel Kant walking through town at the same time every day. And so regular was he that they were able to set their watches by saying, there's Immanuel Kant, therefore it must be 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock or whatever time it happened to be. That's how regular he was. But in his ethical philosophies, he was very unique in his thinking, which is why we incorporate him into our discussion here. The focus in Immanuel Kant's deontology or formalist thinking was that life is a matter of duty. We do what we have because we need to do it, not because it makes us feel better or that it brings about great results or bad results, but because that's what needs to be done and we must do it. So, emphasizes the inherent rightness or wrongness of an action, regardless of what happens next, the consequences, the ends. Contrast that with consequentialism, which consequence, the results, the ends, consequence, it's in the name of this ethical philosophy. It says that if we bring about a result that brings happiness to an individual, then that consequence is good. In a social setting, bringing about happiness for the greatest number of people in that social setting is good. Right? So whatever we do to bring about happiness for the majority of people. So what is happiness? Happiness for the consequentialist or the utilitarian is essentially all the same. So if it makes you feel full and happy and content to eat a good meal, then that's happiness. If it makes you feel happy to win at a video game that you happen to be playing, that's happiness. And those two sets of happiness are equal. If there's happiness for one, happiness for the other, that counts as the same level of happiness. Now, John Stuart Mill took that idea and he kind of developed it a little bit more and say, well, it's not exactly that. If you watch an episode of The Simpsons and find some happiness from that, it's going to last for that half hour or that hour or however long The Simpsons is. I never watched the program, but I've seen a lot of illustrations coming out of the program, and it's pretty good. But that gives you one level of happiness. However, if you go to a concert at the local art center and you listen to Chopin concert where there's an hour of orchestration bringing some of the most profound and sweetest sounds to your ears that you've ever experienced, that gives you a level of happiness as well. Jeremy Bentham would say that level of happiness is the same. John Stuart Mill took Jeremy Bentham's ideas and he said they're not exactly the same. One form of happiness lasts longer than the first form of happiness. So if one lasts 30 minutes, that's good happiness. If it lasts a lifetime, that's even better happiness. So there are gradations of happiness, and that's probably the consequence or the way of summing up John Stuart Mill's consequentialism or utilitarianism. Formalism focuses on rules and principles, figuring out the rules and the laws and the principles that you live your life by. Hopefully we all live by certain principles. Well, actually we do. The only question is whether the laws, rules, and principles are acceptable to the rest of the world. The rest of the world sees those as silly principles, or we can agree upon them. But at least someone who lives a life of principle is demonstrating that they're living a life worthy of their own belief system. But some philosopher, one of the big three ancient Greek philosophers that I love, is attributed with saying that no man acts unethically. I don't think that really came out of the mouths of any one of those great Greek philosophers. However, the idea is not a bad idea. In other words, we act in specific ways not because we're breaking our own rules, but because we have set in our mind that those rules can be broken under certain circumstances. And when we break those rules, we're acting according to our own ethical principles and standards. It's an interesting concept. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Ethical formalism places a strong emphasis on the idea of intention or intent, or in the criminal justice world, which is where I kind of made my hay, criminal justice, mens rea, guilty mind. Some act, an otherwise good act, could become a bad act if someone does that act or that action with bad intent. They intend to hurt somebody. That colors negatively the entire action that's undertaken. Intent. That's pretty big with ethical formalism. It's less important in the idea of consequentialism because consequences, the utility, bringing about specific results, or the ends justifying the means, that's pretty much all that matters in consequentialism. So there's a big contrast between the two ethical systems. So the outcome is what is important. Outcome, where have we heard that? We've heard about disparate outcome in the United States, for instance, and that helps us to decide whether the actions that lead to those disparate outcomes are good or bad, according to, well, when we're making those kind of judgments, we're taking a consequentialist view of the world, aren't we? All right, that's how we're judging those actions to be good or bad. How do we put this down into practical terms? If we put it down into practical terms, we can say, looking at Immanuel Kant and ethical formalism, if something is a bad thing to do, it's always a bad thing to do. Immanuel Kant called that the categorical imperative. Right? Using reason and rationality, according to Kant, we're able to look at every situation and say that it's bad in this instance, therefore it must be bad in every instance. We can universalize that conclusion, and that gives us a categorical imperative. So if we say that it is wrong to kill, it's wrong for me to kill on one occasion, then it's wrong for 8 billion people on Earth to kill on every occasion. Right? That would be the categorical imperative. There's some nuances to that idea, but we're not going to worry about those for the purpose of this video. If killing is wrong, then it's always wrong. It's a bad act. Utilitarian would get back to that idea of killing a killer who's about to assassinate 6 other people and say that under those circumstances, the consequences justify the bad act. And so murder is not always wrong. Formalists would say lying is wrong. Consequentialists would say, well, lying is probably, generally speaking, wrong, but it could be justified under certain circumstances if it brings about the right results. Okay, there you have it. Those are the ideas of ethical formalism and consequentialism. It's enough for us to take these ideas and put them in practical application a little bit later. We'll do that in a few videos. All right, talk to you later.